In the summer of 1969, deep within the Great Smoky Mountains, a 6-year-old boy named Dennis Martin vanished in plain sight. It happened in daylight, surrounded by parents, relatives, and other campers. No footprints, no torn fabric, no sound after the rain. How could a child disappear so completely in one of the most visited national parks in America and never return? The war was far away. Televisions were full of baseball and parades, and the mountains offered the comfort of something timeless, a place where the noise of the world could not reach. For the Martin family from Knoxville, Tennessee, it was a routine of love and tradition. Every Father's Day, they left the city behind to spend a few quiet days together in the woods. William Martin, a mechanical engineer, was a man of order and patience. His father, Clyde, had served in the army and carried himself with the calm discipline of a man who had seen too much of life to take peace for granted. William's 2 sons, Douglas and Dennis, were the kind of boys anyone would expect in the late 60s. Curious, polite, and raised to respect both people and nature. Dennis was 6, small for his age, with brown hair that caught the sunlight in thin streaks, and a shy smile that rarely left his face. He spoke little but remembered everything. His teachers said he had a mind like a map. He liked drawing trails and marking the trees with small, harmless scratches, as if he wanted to leave quiet breadcrumbs in the world. His father often said Dennis never ran, he observed. That Friday morning, June 13th, the 4 of them loaded their packs into the car. William, his father Clyde, and the 2 boys. The weather was mild, the kind that makes a man believe the mountains are welcoming him. Their destination was Spence Field, a high meadow along the Appalachian Trail inside Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It was a place of rolling grass, scattered firs, and a horizon that seemed to go on forever. To most, it was safe, familiar ground. They reached the campsite in the afternoon. The air was thin and sweet, with the smell of pine and rain left from the night before. They met another family there, the Carters, a father and his 2 sons, close in age to the Martins' boys. Strangers in the morning, but by evening the children were chasing one another across the meadow, as if they had grown up together. Laughter rose through the field and faded into the sound of wind. The adults, watching from a distance, said little. It was enough just to see their children run freely, far from the city streets. That night, they all stayed in the same shelter, a wooden structure open on one side, built for hikers. Lanterns hung low. The fathers shared coffee while the boys whispered jokes until they fell asleep. The last sound was the steady rhythm of rain against the roof. By dawn, the rain had cleared. Saturday, June 14th, began with a quiet brightness that only mountain mornings carry. The air was clean, almost thin enough to see through. After breakfast, the group decided to hike further toward the open ridge. Their plan was to spend the day exploring the trails around Spence Field before heading back by evening. The boys walked ahead, running in and out of sight between the trees. They were full of energy, and the fathers allowed them that small freedom, a few yards, no more. Around 4 in the afternoon, as they rested near the edge of the meadow, the children began planning a small prank. The idea was innocent. They would hide in the bushes and jump out to scare the adults. The Carter boys and Douglas quickly chose a spot together, whispering behind the leaves. Dennis, wearing a bright red shirt his mother had chosen so he could be seen easily, was told to hide somewhere else. The color, they said, would give them away. So he nodded, smiled a little, and walked a short distance to find his own hiding place. The fathers waited, pretending not to notice. A minute passed, then 3. The Carter boys leaped out shouting, and everyone laughed. Everyone except Dennis, who didn't appear. William called his name once, lightly, thinking the boy was waiting for the perfect moment. He called again, louder this time. There was no answer, only the wind brushing through the grass. The laughter faded. He walked toward the line of trees where he had last seen his son's red shirt disappear. Nothing moved. He called again, his voice stretching over the slope, but the sound died quickly in the heavy air. Within minutes, the easy rhythm of the afternoon turned to a stillness that no one understood. The other men began to spread out, circling the clearing, expecting to find the boy crouched behind a log or laughing from another direction. But there was only silence. The sun was sinking, the color of rust behind the ridges. In the mountains, light leaves fast, and within half an hour the field was half-shadowed. William ran further downhill, searching through the brush, calling, promising rewards he could not deliver. He found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that a child had ever passed there. When he climbed back up, his father Clyde was already making the decision to go for help. The ranger station was miles away, a long descent followed by a winding road. He would walk it himself. William stayed behind, still calling, still listening. Evening settled over Spence Field with a kind of unreal quiet. The wind picked up again, carrying a chill from the north. Somewhere, far away, thunder echoed across the valley. By the time Clyde reached the ranger outpost, the first drops of rain had already started to fall on the mountain. And up there, beneath the darkening sky, William Martin stood alone in the clearing, his voice swallowed by the rain, still calling the same name into the forest, a name that would, from that night on, never find an answer. By the time the first rangers arrived at Spence Field, darkness had already fallen over the ridge. The air was heavy with rain, the kind that sinks into the ground and erases every trace of where someone has been. William Martin led them back to the place where Dennis was last seen, his flashlight cutting through the fog like a trembling line. The grass was wet and bent, but there were no footprints, no torn leaves, no sound except for water dripping from the branches. What had been a family outing only hours earlier had turned into a scene of disbelief. A father walking in circles, calling his son's name while his voice disappeared into the storm. The first night was chaos disguised as effort. Rangers, soaked to the bone, fanned out with flashlights and shouted in intervals. They tried to keep a grid pattern, but the terrain refused to cooperate. Slopes dropped sharply, paths split without warning, and fog rolled in from the valleys, making every direction look the same. The rain blurred the ground, washing away any clue that might have existed. Somewhere below, creeks swelled and broke their banks. A child's trail, if it had ever been there, was gone. At 2 a.m, the command was given to halt. Visibility had fallen to 0, and even the dogs couldn't track in the flood. William refused to stop. He wandered alone until the rangers pulled him back to camp, afraid he would lose himself next. They wrapped him in a blanket, but he didn't speak. One of the men later wrote in his report, "The father never sat down. He stared into the trees as if waiting for them to return his boy." By dawn, June 15th, the search became official. The National Park Service activated a full-scale rescue operation. Soldiers from nearby bases, forest rangers, local police, volunteer firemen, and civilians poured into the park. Within hours, more than 1,000 people were moving through the Great Smoky Mountains, the largest search ever recorded in a national park up to that time. Helicopters circled above, their blades cutting through fog that refused to lift. The sound of engines echoed against the cliffs, a noise that seemed out of place among the old trees. But with numbers came confusion. There was no single chain of command. Civilians walked through the same areas multiple times, trampling potential evidence. Some carried food and flashlights, others only sticks. A few even brought their children, thinking they could help. From the outside, it looked heroic. From the inside, it was blind panic organized into movement. A ranger later admitted, "We were trying to save a child, but what we really did was bury his trail." The FBI arrived on the second day, treating the disappearance as a possible abduction. They set up base at Cades Cove and began interviewing witnesses. The Carters repeated their story. The children had been playing hide-and-seek. Dennis had chosen his own spot. He never came back. No one had heard a scream, a fall, or an animal. The only sound had been wind. Military personnel began sweeping, the region in widening circles. They used infrared scopes at night, hoping to detect body heat, but the weather turned against them. Heavy rain returned, mixed with lightning that grounded the helicopters. By the third day, exhaustion set in. Dogs brought from nearby police departments refused to pick up a scent. Every time they were led into the brush, they circled, whined, and sat down. The storm had washed away even the smell of the boys' clothing. Reporters gathered at the ranger station, sending stories across the country. 6-year-old boy missing in Smokies, massive search underway. Television crews filmed the endless line of men combing the forest, stepping carefully, calling the same single name over and over. Families watching from their living rooms saw a father standing behind the search line, staring at the trees without blinking. On June 18th, a possible clue surfaced, a series of small footprints in the mud near a stream about 3 miles south of Spence Field. The prints were said to belong to a child no older than 6. Investigators noted that the left foot seemed bare, the right still covered by a small shoe. Hope flared briefly. William Martin believed they were his sons, but a ranger pointed out that several Boy Scouts had passed through the area the same day, and their tracks could match. No photographs were taken before rain came again that afternoon. The prints disappeared by nightfall. Tension began to rise among the teams. Some believed Dennis had wandered too far and succumbed to exposure. Others were convinced someone had taken him. A few whispered about wild animals, bears, cougars, though no sign supported that theory. What remained was silence. By the end of the first week, officials admitted privately that survival was unlikely. The temperature at night had dropped near freezing. A 6-year-old boy in a cotton shirt could not endure that long. But William Martin refused to leave. Every morning he joined a new search group, walking until dusk. When asked why he stayed, he answered simply, "Because no one else knows him like I do." The park's command post filled with maps marked in red pencil, areas searched once, twice, 10 times. Helicopters hovered low, stirring the trees until leaves tore loose. The search widened outward, past the ridges into North Carolina. Nothing. Not a button. Not a thread. After 10 days, the number of searchers began to thin. Volunteers returned to their towns. Soldiers were recalled to base. The forest closed behind them, as if it had never been disturbed. On June 26th, the operation was formally reduced. Only a small corps of trained rangers would continue the search. The rest was left to chance, or perhaps to faith. That evening, William Martin stood at the edge of the clearing where he had last seen his son. The sun had gone, the grass wet again with another round of rain. A ranger beside him whispered that it was time to go. The father didn't answer. He watched the mist drift through the trees, and for a moment it seemed to him that he could hear the faint laughter of children echoing far beyond the field. Not close enough to reach, but near enough to remember. The next morning, the search resumed, smaller, quieter, more methodical. But by then, the mountain had already decided what it would keep and what it would give back. And among the things it kept was a boy in a red shirt whose trail ended where the forest began. When the official search was suspended in late July of 1969, the mountain grew silent again. The tents were packed, the maps rolled up, and the volunteers went back to their ordinary lives. Helicopters no longer circled the ridges. What remained at Spence Field was the stillness of an empty clearing, grass flattened by boots, campfire ashes gone cold, and the echo of a name that had been shouted too many times to count. For the Martin family, that silence was unbearable. William Martin refused to accept the word lost. He believed his son was somewhere beyond the ridge, alive, waiting. In the weeks that followed, while government agencies closed their reports, he came back again and again, sometimes alone, sometimes with small groups of local hikers who knew the terrain. They combed ravines, creek beds, caves, anywhere a child might have hidden. Each time, the mountain answered with the same indifference: fog, wind, and no sign of Dennis. Back in Knoxville, newspapers printed the last photos taken of the boy. He was smiling faintly, his front teeth small and uneven, his hair parted neatly by his mother. The caption read, "Missing since June 14th. Neighbors brought food and condolences, but words did little. Mrs. Martin stayed inside the house most days, refusing interviews. The father became a familiar figure to rangers and hikers in the Smokies. The quiet man who carried maps, asked few questions, and never stopped walking. By autumn, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park had returned to its normal rhythm. Families camped, hikers crossed the trails, and the grass at Spence Field grew tall again. The official file on the disappearance of Dennis Martin was labeled unsolved and stored at the ranger headquarters in Gatlinburg. Inside, it contained less than 30 pages, weather reports, ranger statements, a list of coordinates, and a single note underlined twice. No physical evidence recovered. Years began to pass. New rangers replaced the old. The memory of the missing boy became a story told around campfires. Tour guides mentioned it in low voices, as if afraid the forest might still remember. The Martins received letters from people claiming to have seen a boy who looked like Dennis, in North Carolina, in Georgia, once even in Texas. Each lead ended in disappointment. Most of the letters came from kind strangers who simply wanted to help. Some came from opportunists seeking the $5,000 reward the family had offered. None brought them closer to the truth. Through the 1970s, the FBI maintained the file but added nothing new. Agents who had worked the case were transferred, retired, or reassigned. The disappearance of a 6-year-old in a national park had become a single entry in a list of unresolved investigations. Yet, for William Martin, the case never cooled. Every June, he returned to the mountains on the anniversary of his son's disappearance, sometimes accompanied by former rangers who still felt uneasy about how quickly the search had been abandoned. They found nothing, not a shoe, not a thread of the red shirt that had once been so easy to spot. The years etched the father's face into something harder, more deliberate. Those who met him described a man whose calm had turned into endurance. He never accused anyone, never speculated publicly. But there was always a weight in his voice when he spoke of the forest, as if he believed it had taken something it had no right to keep. In 1974, a park official suggested that Dennis had most likely died of exposure within the first 48 hours. The statement appeared in a local newspaper under the headline, "Authorities close file on Martin disappearance." When asked to comment, William replied only, "A file can close. That doesn't mean the truth does." He continued to search privately, using his own money to hire local trackers. Each came back with the same conclusion: no trace. By the end of the decade, the story of the missing boy was half forgotten beyond Tennessee. Tourists passing through the Smokies might see a weathered bulletin at the ranger post with a black and white photograph of a smiling child and the words, "Still missing." Few stopped to read it. Yet among those who lived near the park, the case lingered like a rumor that refused to die. Some said the boy had been taken by a wild animal. Others whispered darker possibilities, that he had been carried off by someone hiding in the mountains, a drifter or a fugitive. With every retelling, the details blurred, until it was no longer clear what was truth and what was imagination. Still, there were moments when hope intruded. A hunter once reported seeing a small figure near the ridge at dusk, dressed in torn clothes, moving quickly through the trees. Rangers investigated, but found only deer tracks. Another man claimed he heard a child's cry in the wind one night while camping near Spence Field, though he later admitted it could have been the call of a fox. The human mind, after all, is eager to turn sounds into meaning when silence lasts too long. Through the 1980s, the Martins aged quietly. William kept working at the factory until his retirement, visiting the mountains less often but never forgetting. The last recorded note in the official file from that decade reads, "Family maintains contact with Park Service. No new information." Time dulled the urgency, but not the ache. The boy who had vanished without a trace was now, in the eyes of the law, presumed dead. But among those who had walked the search lines, the question remained, how does a 6-year-old child disappear in daylight, surrounded by hundreds of people, leaving not one sign of struggle, not one belonging behind? The mountains had offered no answer. And as years turned into decades, it began to seem that whatever truth lay hidden beneath the trees had been buried there for good, unless, by chance or by persistence, someone would one day disturb it again. It was a local newspaper column that reopened the wound. July of 1969 had nearly ended when the Knoxville News Sentinel printed an interview with a man named Harold Key, a resident from Alabama, who had been vacationing with his family near the same mountains on the day Dennis disappeared. His account, modest in tone but rich in detail, introduced a new and unsettling layer to the case. According to Key, his family had been picnicking near Cades Cove, roughly 10 kilometers from Spence Field, when they heard something that made them stop eating. It was not a word, but a cry, short, high-pitched, and desperate, like the sound of a child in pain. The noise came from across a shallow valley, muffled by trees. As he stood up to look, Key saw movement among the shadows. A tall, unkempt man, dressed in rough, dark clothes, who appeared to be hiding behind a cluster of brush. For a moment their eyes met, and then the stranger slipped deeper into the forest, almost melting into it. At the time, Key had not connected what he saw with the missing boy. Only later, while reading about the search in the paper, did he realize the dates matched. The same Saturday, the same hour between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. The man he saw had been moving toward the road that led out of the park. The sound he heard before that, he said, still haunted him. It was a scream that didn't finish, he told reporters. When the FBI received the report, they contacted Key immediately. An agent from the Knoxville office arranged to meet him at the park. Together they retraced his route, marking the point where the family had been and where the sound had come from. The coordinates placed the location almost 10 kilometers away from where Dennis was last seen. That distance, combined with the steep terrain, presented a problem. A 6-year-old could not have traveled that far in less than 30 minutes, not through dense forest and rocky slopes. The agents noted the inconsistency, but did not dismiss it outright. They requested detailed maps, cross-checked times, and compared Key's statement with weather records and search logs. Everything aligned except for the distance. It was physically impossible for Dennis to have reached that spot on his own. Which left one explanation. Someone else might have carried him there, The FBI considered the possibility of abduction, but handled the information with caution. Officially, the case remained classified as a missing person under unknown circumstances. Privately, agents debated whether to make the details public. In the end, they decided to keep it confidential, citing the potential compromise of investigative integrity. The Martins were not informed. Weeks later, William Martin read the story by accident in the newspaper. It was the first time he had heard the name, Harold Key. The idea that someone had seen a man hiding in the forest the very day his son vanished hit him harder than any official report. He called the FBI office, demanding clarification. The answer he received was brief. "We're aware of that account, sir, and we're looking into it." But there was no follow-up, no written statement, no acknowledgement in the file. The secrecy disturbed him. He began to suspect that the authorities were holding something back, that perhaps the story of a lost child had been protecting a darker truth. In interviews years later, he would recall that phone call as the moment when he stopped believing the disappearance had been an accident. The official record shows that the FBI returned to the Key family a second time, hoping to verify the details. During that meeting, Harold's recollection grew sharper. He described the man in the woods as tall, maybe 6 feet or more, with long hair, moving fast but low, as if trying not to be seen. He added a new detail, that the man appeared to be carrying something over his shoulder, though he could not see what it was. A sack, maybe, or something wrapped in cloth. The note from the agent's report ends with the line, "Witness uncertain of object." Over the years, the story changed again. Some versions claimed the man was barefoot. Others said his clothes were torn, as if he had been living rough for weeks. A few insisted he had blood on his hands. None of these details were confirmed. Memory, shaped by fear and repetition, tends to decorate itself. Still, the core of Key's story, the scream, the man in the thicket, the direction toward the road, remained constant. Within law enforcement circles, opinions divided. Some agents saw the account as credible, arguing that the distance problem could be solved if the boy had been abducted immediately after vanishing. Others believed it was coincidence, the scream nothing more than the cry of an animal, the man perhaps a hunter or hiker startled by the noise. Without evidence, no footprints, no fibers, no vehicle identified, the case could not advance beyond speculation. For the Martin family, however, the implication was devastating. If Dennis had been taken, it meant he might have been alive for hours, even days, after the search began. The thought hollowed William. He returned once more to the mountain with a copy of the article in his pocket, tracing the trails that led from Spence Field down toward Cades Cove. The path was steep, tangled with roots and streams, but he walked it anyway, step by step, as if trying to retrace a journey he had never witnessed. He reached a point where the trail narrowed into thick underbrush, almost impossible to pass. He stood there a long time, listening to the forest breathe. Somewhere nearby, a bird broke into a single, sharp cry before falling silent again. The FBI never issued a public statement on the Key testimony. In the official case log, the entry occupies less than 1 page, dated July 28, 1969. The final sentence reads, "No direct connection to missing child established." And beneath it, a second note in pencil, faint but legible. Possible relevance, further evaluation if new evidence emerges. It never did. But for those who had spent days on the mountain shouting the boy's name, the story of the man in the thicket became a quiet obsession, a shadow that followed every retelling of the case. Some believed it was the first honest clue. Others thought it was just another mirage born from grief and coincidence. Either way, it shifted the story forever. The disappearance of Dennis Martin was no longer a tragedy of nature alone. From that point on, It carried the echo of something human. More than a decade had passed since the summer Dennis Martin vanished, and yet the name still clung to the Great Smoky Mountains like mist over the ridges. Locals who had once joined the search now told the story to newcomers as a cautionary tale. A boy lost, a family broken, a mystery that the mountain refused to give back. By the early 1980s, time had washed away the urgency, but not the unease. The official file sat in a drawer marked closed, though no one dared call it solved. In 1985, a rumor began to stir through the small communities around the park. It started with a man known among rangers as a ginseng hunter, one of those who slipped into restricted areas at dawn to dig up roots and sell them quietly for cash. According to the account later recorded by a retired park employee, this man claimed he had stumbled upon something strange in a hollow not far from the western edge of the park, an area known as Big Hollow, about 5 kilometers from where Dennis had disappeared 16 years earlier. The man told a friend that he had been digging under an old tree root when his spade struck something hard. Expecting stone, he brushed away the dirt and found small fragments of bone, pale and brittle. At first he thought they belonged to an animal. Then, as he cleared the soil further, he noticed the shape of a small skull. Terrified, he covered the hole again and left. Days later, he confessed what he had seen to an acquaintance who, by chance, knew one of the park rangers. But he begged not to be identified. He had been poaching ginseng, and being caught meant heavy fines or prison. The ranger, now older and less bound by procedure, led a small unofficial search of his own, accompanied by 2 volunteers. They trekked into Big Hollow in late autumn, when the leaves had fallen and the air was sharp with cold. They found the tree easily enough, a great oak scarred by lightning, but the ground was layered thick with years of leaves and roots. They dug for hours without result. Whether the hunter's story had been true or not, the forest had already reclaimed what he might have seen. News of the rumor reached William Martin. He was nearly 60 by then, thinner, slower, but still driven by the same quiet persistence. He traveled to the site himself, guided by one of the men who had gone with the ranger. The climb was steep, the path uneven. They found no bones, no trace of disturbed soil, only the wind moving through the branches. A reporter who later interviewed Martin described him standing at the spot, looking down at the earth, saying softly, "If it was here, the mountain has hidden him well." Around the same period, another voice emerged, a ranger named Dwight McCarter, who had taken part in the original 1969 search. In an interview years later, he revealed that during those first frantic days, he had caught the smell of decay while patrolling a ravine west of Spence Field. He reported it to his superior, but was told that another team had already covered the area and found nothing. "They said it was probably a dead animal," McCarter recalled. Maybe it was, or maybe it wasn't. His comment reignited old suspicions that the search, for all its scale, had never truly been coordinated. As the years wore on, the story of Dennis Martin began to cross into folklore. The Smoky Mountains are rich with old legends, whispers of wild men, strange lights, and creatures that live beyond the reach of towns. It was perhaps inevitable that the boy's disappearance would feed those tales. Hikers spoke of hearing faint laughter deep in the woods, or seeing flashes of red fabric between the trees. Most dismissed it as imagination, but imagination can keep a story alive when evidence cannot. Then came the darker theories. Some said that Dennis had been taken by a feral man, one of the so-called wild people rumored to live in the remote valleys, remnants of families who had refused to leave when the park was created decades earlier. Others spoke of something not quite human, borrowing the shape of old frontier myths, the Sasquatch, the woodman, the thing that walks upright in silence. To most, these were nothing but attempts to fill an unbearable void with meaning. But in the quiet corners of Tennessee, such stories found willing ears. Law enforcement never endorsed those ideas. The official stance remained that Dennis Martin had likely become lost, succumbed to exposure, and that his remains had been scattered by wildlife before searchers could locate them. It was a conclusion of necessity more than certainty, a way to close a file that had already outlived its witnesses. But even among the investigators, few believed that explanation fully. There were too many gaps. No clothing, no bones, no evidence of an animal attack. Only disappearance, clean and total. In 1989, 20 years after the event, a journalist revisited the case for a regional magazine. He spent months interviewing surviving rangers, family members, and local residents. His article ended with a single sentence that captured the heart of the mystery. In a place where even a footprint can last a decade, how can a child vanish without leaving one? For the Martins, life had narrowed to quiet routines. Mrs. Martin rarely left the house. William, retired, spent his days gardening, his nights reading maps of the Smokies, tracing routes that led nowhere. He never stopped believing that someone, somewhere, knew what had happened. And he carried a growing conviction that his son's disappearance was not the work of the mountain, but of a man. By the time the 1990s arrived, the case had grown into a ghost story disguised as history, retold on radio shows, true crime programs, and eventually the early internet. People debated whether Dennis had wandered, been taken, or met something far stranger. Each version drew on fragments of real evidence twisted by decades of retelling. But through it all, one fact refused to change. No trace of him had ever been found. Somewhere between truth and legend, between the living and the missing, the boy in the red shirt remained. The forest kept its silence, and those who once searched for him had grown old enough to wonder if the answers had been buried not in the ground, but in the parts of memory that choose to forget. And yet, as the last of the original rangers retired, one of them left a note in his personal logbook, found years later by his daughter. It read, "The mountain took many, but the Martin boy, that one still feels wrong." By the time the new century arrived, the disappearance of Dennis Martin had become more than a case file. It was a wound woven into the history of the Great Smoky Mountains, half folklore, half unfinished investigation. There were no new discoveries, no hidden confession, no sudden find by a hiker or hunter. Yet the story refused to die. It survived because too many people, from rangers to writers, could not accept that a child could simply vanish into air that thin. In 2012, a book titled Missing Person 1 brought the case back to public memory. The author, a retired park historian, had interviewed William Martin years before his death. In those pages, the father spoke with a tone of calm that only time can forge. "They say he was lost," he said, "but I've walked that mountain for half my life. You don't lose a child that way. Someone takes him from you." The book also summarized a small, rarely mentioned test conducted years earlier. A group of rangers had attempted to walk from the point where Dennis disappeared to the place where witness Harold Key had claimed to see a strange man. The trip took a little more than an hour, even for adults carrying nothing. It was not impossible. If someone had carried Dennis, the timeline fit. 4 years later, a second account emerged, deepening the unease. In 2016, another investigator, Michael Bouchard, a former law enforcement officer, published Missing in the Smoky Mountains. His book included a new interview with the now 90-year-old Harold Key, the man whose testimony had once been locked away in FBI files. Time had not softened Key's memory. If anything, it had sharpened it. He insisted that the newspaper stories from 1969 had twisted his words. According to Key, He and his family had never seen a creature or a wild man. What they saw was a man in his 30s or 40s, filthy, nervous, and human. Before that moment, they had passed a white car parked beside the narrow road at the edge of the forest. The vehicle was empty, engine cold. Moments later, deep in the trees, came the cry, high, panicked, unmistakably that of a child. Then the man appeared, watching them from the brush. When their eyes met, he bolted toward the road, jumped into the white car, and drove away. Key admitted that he had stayed silent about those details for decades. In the days after his report, someone had called his home late at night, a man's voice, low and calm, warning him not to get involved with the boy. The caller hung up before Key could answer. Afraid for his family, he never repeated what he had heard to the authorities. He assumed the FBI knew more than they revealed. Only in his final years, he said, did he decide to tell the story in full. The new statement ignited debate. If true, it meant Dennis Martin had not been lost in the wilderness at all. He had been taken, abducted in broad daylight, only meters away from his family, and carried out of the park before the search even began. Investigators cross-checked the claim with the park's old phone logs and found something chilling. On the evening of June 14, 1969, a woman had called the ranger station to report that she had seen a boy resembling Dennis in a white sedan driven by a man near the western exit of the park. The note was brief, written in pencil, and dismissed at the time as one of many false leads. The pieces, scattered across half a century, began to align, but only loosely, like shapes seen through fog. A witness heard a scream. Another saw a car. The timing matched, the locations nearly matched, and yet no name, no license plate, no suspect had ever surfaced. It was enough for speculation, but never for certainty. The FBI declined to reopen the file, stating that all available evidence had been examined to its fullest extent. For those who had followed the case, the new version of events carried a strange mixture of relief and dread. If the abduction theory was true, then Dennis might not have suffered alone in the cold, as so many had imagined. But it also meant that someone, a living person, had committed a crime and walked away unseen. It turned the tragedy from an act of nature into something human, deliberate, and far more difficult to forgive. William Martin did not live to hear Harold Key's final testimony. He passed away quietly in Knoxville in 2014. His wife, according to relatives, kept their son's last school photo on the bedside table until her own death 2 years later. They never stopped leaving messages with park authorities, never stopped asking that the file remain open. When Missing in the Smoky Mountains was released, readers flooded the Park Service with inquiries. Rangers, some too young to remember the event, found themselves standing in front of the old search maps, explaining to strangers how a child could vanish within a radius smaller than a city block. One of them, a veteran of the Smokies for 30 years, said to a journalist, "We've found bones from the Civil War up here, but not him. That tells me it wasn't the mountain." Still, doubt lingers. Skeptics point out that memory, stretched across 50 years, bends easily. Harold Key's recollection might have mixed moments, misjudged distances, or merged the sound of an animal's cry with his fear. The white car might have belonged to a tourist, the fleeing man to a vagrant startled by a search party. Without physical evidence, the abduction theory remains a possibility, not a fact. And yet, there is a human gravity in Key's words, the same gravity that draws men like William Martin to keep walking the same trails long after the search is over. The need to believe that there was an answer, that his child's disappearance had reason, however cruel, outweighed the comfort of randomness. Today, the official line in the National Park Service records still reads, "Status: missing, presumed deceased." No amendment, no addendum. But among those who have studied the case, the phrase has lost its certainty. Because somewhere between what the witnesses saw and what the reports omitted lies a smaller, quieter truth. That the boy may not have vanished into the wilderness at all, but into the hands of someone who knew exactly how to disappear. And that possibility, however faint, keeps the case alive, a whisper of movement in the forest that never truly sleeps, and the question that still hangs in the mountain air. If someone took him, how did they vanish so completely too? When time becomes the only witness left, every silence begins to speak. Half a century has passed since the afternoon when Dennis Martin stepped into a patch of brush and vanished. The world around the Great Smoky Mountains has changed. Paved roads where there were once trails, cameras where there was once only watchful memory. But the story remains. Rangers still point towards Spence Field when visitors ask about the old case. And each June, flowers appear beneath a small wooden sign at the site. Red ones, always red. No one knows who leaves them. William and his wife, both gone now, carried the absence until their final days. Friends recalled that William's study never changed. On the wall hung a topographic map of the Smokies, marked with small red pins, each one representing a place he had searched. Near the desk lay his hiking boots, kept polished though rarely worn in later years. In his final interview, he spoke softly, without bitterness. "People say the mountain took him," he said, "but the mountain has no hands." Among the investigators who once worked the case, a few were still alive into the 2000s. One of them, a former ranger named McCarter, gave an interview to a local paper after his retirement. He said that the Martin disappearance had changed how the park handled missing person cases forever. "Before Dennis," he explained, "we treated lost hikers like statistics. After Dennis, every report became a name, a story, a family waiting somewhere." The Park Service soon adopted standardized search grids, scent control, and record-keeping protocols, practices that are now routine nationwide. Out of one family's tragedy came a system meant to keep others from repeating it. Yet even with procedure and technology, the Smoky Mountains have kept their reputation as a place that swallows things whole. Over the decades, a handful of other disappearances have been logged, none as haunting, none as complete. Each time, journalists invoke the Martin boy, as if saying his name could explain the rest. Those who study the case professionally call it a perfect loss. No witness of the moment of disappearance, no physical evidence, no verified clue. Every line of inquiry, weather, animals, terrain, criminal abduction, ends in contradiction. The files, yellowed at the corners, now rest in climate-controlled archives. Inside are the same fragments: the father's statement, the rain logs, Harold Key's interview, the sketch of the red-shirted child smiling for a school photo. That picture, scanned and reproduced endlessly online, has become almost an icon, a face not of tragedy but of enduring mystery. The latest generation of park employees approach it with reverence. Some avoid the area after dusk. Others, quietly, leave offerings when they pass the site. One ranger wrote anonymously in a park newsletter, "We don't talk about him to scare people. We talk about him to remember how easily a moment can slip from sight." In Knoxville, a small local history museum keeps a corner dedicated to the case. It holds copies of news articles, a map of the 1969 search, and a pair of worn children's shoes similar to the kind Dennis wore. Not his, only a stand-in, but placed there to remind visitors of scale. Every year, a few families stop, read, and fall silent. If there is one thread that ties all retellings together, it is the question of faith without proof. William Martin died believing his son was taken, that somewhere, somehow, there had been a human choice behind the loss. Others, including some of the rangers, hold to the gentler notion that the boy simply wandered too, Far, caught in a storm, he could not outlast. The difference between those beliefs is less than it seems. Both are ways of refusing to let him vanish entirely. In the stillness of the forest, the wind moves through the trees much as it did that day. The grass at Spence Field grows tall every summer, and the trail markers have been replaced, but the air carries the same chill when clouds roll over the ridges. Visitors who stand there often describe a sense of pause, not fear, exactly, but awareness. A feeling that someone once called out from that very place and was never answered. In the years since, researchers have mapped the timeline, charted every search pattern, even run computer models of possible paths a child could have taken. All lead into blank spaces. There are no endings that satisfy. Yet perhaps the truth lies not in the evidence, but in the endurance of those who kept looking long after the world moved on. Because in the end, the story of Dennis Martin is less about how he disappeared and more about the people who could not stop hearing his name in the rain. Today, at the edge of the clearing, there stands a small wooden post carved with 4 words, "In memory of Dennis Martin." Someone, no one knows who, has tied to it a child's red ribbon. When the wind rises, it flutters gently against the bark, bright against the green, a faint pulse of color in the quiet. And as dusk folds over the valley, the question that has lingered for more than 50 years returns once more, soft as the breath of the forest itself. Did the mountain keep him, or did someone carry him away? If you want to keep following real stories of missing people and the traces they left behind, remember to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe, so the next case finds you before it's forgotten. Tell us where you watch from,